Get it worked out.
Do you want a mic thing? Yeah.
Alright, inshallah we'll make a start. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah amma ba'd. All praise is due to Allah, and may the peace and the blessings be upon His beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I bear witness that there is no one worthy of worship except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is the last and the final of the messages sent to the entire mankind. Just first of all, sisters up the back, is my voice projection sufficient for this purpose? You can all hear me? Because I normally won't get louder than this, so we'll see how we go. If I drop at any point, just let me know, inshallah. First of all, has security been arranged for this session?
Yeah.
I think
should be alright. It shouldn't be shot down or anything.
I think it's very necessary because I'll say it quietly, but I have in my possession something that can really be considered a threat to national security. It's a direct threat to this campus, and indeed, of course, has been described as a threat to our very existence, our way of life. So, if I reveal the implement that I'm carrying, please don't be alarmed. Be alert, but don't be alarmed. But it really is a matter of national security. Are you all ready? All right. Here it is.
Don't worry. Don't worry, bro.
No, I'm not going to wear it. Don't be ridiculous. It's a scarf. Threatening, isn't it? Very threatening. I mean, I don't know how I could even carry such an implement. It's intimidating. It really is intimidating. Is anyone scared? Do you want to put it away? It's really threatening. And apparently it is a real existential threat to the Western way of life. And you know, to be honest, all jokes aside, I'll put my props back, all jokes aside, I genuinely agree with the proponents of this view. You might be surprised, but I really genuinely agree that it is a threat to the Australian way of life and to the Western way of life. I'm not usually in agreement with most right-wing commentators, but on this one, them and I are the same, 100%, but for slightly different reasons, and I'll explain precisely what I mean in a moment. We are having this discussion at a time when it's not only the hijab under attack, it's almost every aspect of our Islamic identity. We have attacks on our aqidah, on our central belief systems. We have attacks on our Prophet, may the peace and blessings be upon him. We have attacks on the entire Islamic dress code. We have attacks on the hijab, on the niqab. We have attacks on Islamic schools as potential hotbeds of extremism. We have attacks even on our Islamic institutions like our masajids. Right? Again, you know, this insidious hotbed of radicalism. You know, we have the cartoons. We have the whole notion of immigration. We have the whole notion of the war on terror. We have, if you're not a terrorist, then you're an extremist. If you're not an extremist, then you're a radical. If you're not a radical, then you're a radical sympathiser. Then you're a potential radical, etc., etc. Every day, a core component of our Islam is being directly challenged, and it's being dragged through the broadsheets and the tabloids, and on the TVs and across the radio waves, like we have never seen before. And sometimes it becomes a little bit overwhelming just to connect the dots, because you feel at a time that out of nowhere an issue arises. And you think, where in God's name did they pull this out? And why now? And really there is no logical consistency to it, except one line of argument which I'll get to in a moment. Because if you think about it for a moment, over a year ago, a certain individual delivered a certain lecture at a certain mosque. Why is it an issue now? Why? Who can explain to me thoroughly why it is an issue now and needs its attention now? Why, at a certain point in history, did the whole notion of immigration become, you know, a question of national security? Whereas the week before, we were all celebrating the utopian view of multiculturalism, that migrants were a great asset to this country, and overnight they became a threat to this country. The very same people who aspire to a better way of life now are seeking to undermine this way of life. And so when we talk about hijab, don't for a moment believe that the issue is hijab itself. It is not. And it never was, and it never will be. What it is, or what the discussion should be, is about what the hijab represents. And this is the focus of my discussion today. Why do I say that? Because Islamically, the issue of hijab is a non-issue. I'm sorry, but there are very few issues in Islam that are so open and shut like the hijab. If we had a discussion on niqab, okay, I will entertain the difference of opinions, the different scholars in the past and the different madhahibs. But on the issue of hijab, unanimity, absolute consensus. There are slight differences as to the precise wearing of the hijab, below the chin, above the chin, etc. But the idea that the hijab is an obligation in Islam and that our sisters need to cover their hair and their bodies accordingly, as described in the 2 ayat, no disagreement whatsoever. And so if I was going to deliver a lecture about hijab, it would be over in 3 minutes. Seriously, it would be over in 3 minutes. So I'm going to take the liberty to extend this lecture to 5 minutes, and then leave most of the time to question and answers, inshallah. The discussion about hijab, right, is not even a discussion had by Muslims, to be honest. When was the last time a sister ran up to you and said, "Look, brother," or "Look, sister, I am so overwhelmed with this headscarf that it's this cultural imposition that I reject, and I reject that Islam will dictate this upon me"? Seriously, when was the last time you had this discussion? It's the opposite. It's like, "Oh brother, oh sister, it's difficult in these circumstances, but I want to because this is my obligation in Islam and I want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala." Open and shut. Very, very simple argument. And so the question about hijab, or the discussion about hijab, is in fact, as I'll show in a moment, a discussion about values. It's a discussion about values, is it about identity, and it is in fact, whether you like it or not, about allegiances. Because this hijab is ostensibly a very public manifestation of Islam, and it is symbolic for that reason. But if the brothers and sisters on this campus were to organise a lecture on any other topic, I guarantee you almost that I'd be discussing the very same points. If it was about niqab, if it was about the male dress code, if it was about Sharia, the apparent barbarity of the Sharia, if it was about jihad, about khilafah, about whatever, about the Prophet ﷺ, about cartoons, it would be the precise same points covered in these discussions. Because what underpins the discussion is not the issue in itself, it's a red herring. We need to go beyond the headlines and discuss the issue themselves. And I'll show you through their own words, of course, how they understand the matter. How they understand, when I say they, I'll describe what I mean precisely, how this discussion is not about the headscarf itself. And they will describe it in those terms. They describe, or say they define the parameters in the way that I've described, as over questions of values, over identity, and over allegiances. But I know, I'm informed of course, that a question arose naturally as to why a brother is talking about hijab. And it's a fair question. And what can I say? Either some people look at me as being quite effeminate, or there's an ulterior motive behind it. Or it could be both. But I'll say this, yeah, that in a very polite way, some people need to be ignored. But I don't mean people who question the fact that a brother was giving this lecture. But I mean the people who need to be ignored is what I call postmodernist secular liberals. The very people who want everything to be gender constructed or class, or part of some class war effort, and break everything down as if the entire world is constructed on a relative basis that's full of biases, etc., etc. These people need to be very politely ignored. At times condemned openly and harshly, but at other times very politely ignored. Why? Because Islam is gender neutral. Islam is class neutral. The Prophet ﷺ said in one hadith, and I quote the meaning, that whoever performs ijtihad based upon his whims, then let him select his seat in Jahannam. Right? It's a very strong word, very strong hadith. That even a mujtahid, a scholar, right, that defines an issue based upon his own whims and desires, right, which is what postmodernists describe as, constructionism, right, full of his own power implements and his own power plays. If someone defines things and derives the ijtihad, meaning he wants a solution to fit his own desires, meaning he's not genuinely accessing Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah for a genuine Islamic solution. Anyone who does this, then let him select his seat in Jahannam. It's very strong and very direct. That when an Islamic prescription is derived, it's not because it is a man that prescribes it, or a woman that prescribes it, or a man that derives it, or a woman that derives it, or the poor, or the rich, or the young, or the old, or the black, or the white. These questions are irrelevant because the Islamic text and Islam itself transcends all of these trivialities. And so whether it's me discussing this issue or a sister discussing an issue has no relevance on the issue itself. The only concern for all of us is the correctness of one's view. And this needs to be reiterated again and again. There are no such things as, the domain of a man or the domain of a woman, except in a few detailed fiqh issues, which I think we all understand without me getting explicit about it. Right? If it's, if only women can have knowledge over those things, or only men can have knowledge over certain things, in the personal things, then that's understood. And Islam actually acknowledges that. Right? Very much acknowledges that. But in the whole of Islam, the notion of class bias or gender bias needs to be completely, comprehensively rejected. We're talking about a system from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that transcends all of humanity, both man and woman. And both the male and the female has to submit to the dictates of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, specifically on the issue of hijab, why the question on hijab? Why the incessant attack on the hijab? When I delivered a lecture many, many years ago, when France first banned the hijab, prior to that, the whole discussion was framed in a very unique way. That all the politicians and the commentators then were describing the hijab as a threat to the secular order of France. Think about that for a moment. This hijab, right, is going to undermine 300 years of the French Republic. Right? It's going to push back the whole European Renaissance. And what I said at the beginning, to be honest, I agree. Right? I agree. I'm not suggesting we don't need bullets anymore, right? But I'm suggesting what this represents, right, is precisely what they were describing. It is a piece of cloth, but it's more than that. They understand it's more than that. Why? Because we were born or raised in this country, or we live in this country now, and this country is a product of the whole European Renaissance, built around secularism, built around democracy, built around the whole notion of individualism. And so we're told from a very young age, even before we are born, it's embedded in our mums and dads' minds, that individualism is of the highest order, and nothing should be subordinate to the notion of individualism. That I define what is right, I define what is good. I define what I should do and what I shouldn't do. What I accept to be good and what I define to be bad. This is individualism, libertarianism, call it whatever you want. It's the worship of the self. But Muslims come along and they say, hold on a moment. Rather than accepting this secular view of the world that not only discounts but dismisses the role of the Creator in defining practically how we live our life, the Muslims say no. In fact, the best way forward, and the only way forward, not just for me as a Muslim, but for the whole of humanity, is in fact to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the greatest liberation comes only when we submit comprehensively and wholeheartedly to the dictates of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So they say, okay, you Muslims, you should be like us. Take off the hijab, put on the shorts, go clubbing, go do whatever people do, right? And I'm sure we all understand what I mean. Muslims say no. I would rather live a life of dignity, of honor, of, there's a word here, sanctity, right? Divine sanctity. I will place myself above the carnal desires. I will refuse to worship my own desires, to worship me as a man or worship other men. and worship any other man-made system. And the Muslims believe that very, very passionately. If tomorrow the government says, hey, you Muslims, right, and sure, khimar doesn't speak like this, but say theoretically, you Muslims, no longer are you allowed to pray. What are we going to say? I say, go jump, mate. Seriously, we may say it in a more sophisticated manner. I say, go jump, mate. No chance in hell will you ever stop me praying, right? True or not? It may be difficult, right? Some people might break, but en masse, right, tell him where to jump, right, in a great Aussie tradition. If tomorrow they say, look, no one is allowed to go perform Hajj anymore, right, I guarantee you, right, there will be more Muslims on boats leaving this country than there will be Muslims coming to this country on boats. Who's going to stop me from performing the Hajj? Right, I'll crawl up and down, left and right to get to where I need to be. If they say, look, oh Muslims, right, in Ramadan, everyone has to eat. No one's allowed to fast. What are you going to say? Go jump, mate. Seriously, you say, go jump. What chance in hell do you have? And who the hell are you to tell me what I can and can't do, right? Especially when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said the precise opposite. And so whether we like it or not, right, we carry an idea, a belief, right, and from that a set of practices, right, that fundamentally disagrees with the whole notion of individualism, the whole notion of libertarianism. But it's not a problem necessarily if it just exists in individuals, yeah? It really is not a problem. Because they say, do whatever you want, mate. I don't really care if you pray. Put your foot in the sink at work. They don't really care. Right? Just do your own thing, right? It doesn't bother me. But when does it bother them? Because apparently it does bother them now, right? To the extent that they have to ban it. To the extent that everyone in Europe is discussing the very same point, right? They start with niqab as pure symbolism, but everyone understands the issue starts somewhere but ends somewhere else, right? They're afraid of the whole notion of Islamization. Yeah, it's fear-mongering. Yeah, it's to play on, you know, create mass hysteria. Of course it is. Everyone understands that, but you expect it. But why is it a problem now? This is the real question, yeah? And I have a theory, and tell me if I'm right or wrong. Right, in any society, it can accept a certain level of, let's say, diversity, until at some point you realise that that level of diversity can at some point become an existential threat. Even though it may not be an imminent threat, but if it is allowed to continue, right, at some point, we're going to change the social order. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean precisely what I described before. If a certain individual carries a certain idea, right, which contradicts the foundations of secular society, it's fine as an individual. But when the individual identity morphs into a collective identity, then it becomes a problem. And this is why it's a problem today. It's not that Muslim sisters are wearing hijab. That's not the problem. The problem is collectively as Muslims in Western lands, right, which is a direct derivative of what's happening in the Muslim world, but that's another discussion for another time. Collectively, we are all returning to our Islam. En masse. Yeah, there are exceptions, right? I mean, it's obvious, it doesn't need to be mentioned. Right, there are Muslims who are going the other way. But overwhelmingly, right, Muslims en masse are coming back to their Islam, which means, in practical terms, they maintain an Islamic identity, an Islamic belief system, they seek to manifest that belief system, and they seek to export that belief system. We all know, whenever we talk to our non-Muslim colleagues, it's always in this tone of pity, you know, almost sorrowness. Like, I really want you to have Islam for your sake, mate. For your sake, right? We are, you know, they would love us to believe that there exists this identity crisis amongst the Muslims, right? There is no bigger load of, you know what, than that fact, right? This whole issue of identity crisis will resolve many, many years ago for the Muslims, right? If anyone has an identity crisis, yeah, it ain't us, right? We are sure of who we are. We are sure of what we believe in, right? We're sure of what we represent, what Islam represents. And we want it, right? And we're holding on to it, and we want more of it, right? We need more Islamic schools, right? All the newlyweds, all the new parents, right? They're all going on about, oh, where am I going to send my kids, right? I don't want to really send them to a public school and send them to Islamic school. Everyone's saying that. I say, I need a female doctor, or I want a male doctor. Everyone's saying that. Right? I want to send my kids to the mosque and I want to teach them Arabic. Everyone is saying that. Meaning en masse, we are reattaching ourselves, realigning ourselves solely with Islam. And so the only people who have this identity crisis, right, are the kuffar themselves. And we know in this country, twice a year, this comes as the boil. Anzac Day, which is around the corner, right, and Australia Day. Every year it's the same discussion, right? How should we celebrate the legacy of the Anzacs? And there's always a discussion about, is it relevant today, is it not relevant? Are we rewriting history? Is it an accurate description of what happened back then, right? We all know they got slaughtered, mate. They were comprehensively slaughtered because they were stooges to the British, right? But no one ever defined, like, no one ever defines it in those terms. It's like, you know, the heroism, the bravery, and the courage, right? And they leave away the element of stupidity, right? Who goes and just parks themselves in the place where they're going to get slaughtered, right? Don't even ask where they're going, and the irony is they even landed in the wrong spot the first time. But it's not to take the mickey out, right? It's to demonstrate a very clear and a very important discussion. That, you know, on Australia Day, it's always, what does it mean to be Australian? And to this day, they cannot describe or define what it means to be Australian. Especially in the Howard era, saying you Muslims should become more Australian. I said, all right, mate, just tell us what it is. Right? Tell us what it is first, and then we'll decide whether we want it or not. But they could not even have the courage to stand in the face of the Muslims and say, this is exactly what we represent, and this is exactly what we want from you. Nothing. If anything, the cowards will come around and say, look, you know, to be Australian is to be Muslim. Really, what Australia has is really what the Sharia has anyway. In principle, it's all the same. They have to invite us to something, they have to Islamize it for us. Right? The filth and the corruption that we see in society, they want to pretend that it's Islamic. I mean, that's the only way we'll accept it. They tell us democracy. Right? The Prophet ﷺ was the first Democrat. They tell us that. Right? The only way they can convince us to accept something is if they convince us it's from Islam. So the only ones with an identity crisis is not the Muslims, but of course the kuffar. And so the whole discussion about hijab, in fact, reveals the latent and inherent insecurities of the West, in terms of identity, in terms of values. No one will come up to you and say, look, you Muslims, you should reject all the commandments from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you should have placed full faith and sovereignty in the parliament. Never say that to your face. They'll never confront the aqidah directly. I say, no one will come to you and say, you should remove the hijab. I don't care what your Quran says to you. I don't care what example your Prophet set for you or set for you. You do what we want. Right? This is barbaric. This is uncivilized, etc. You never hear that. Never hear that. Because they're so insecure. Right? All they're good at is the rhetoric. You know, like the bullies at school? The bullies at school are the biggest wusses. The most insecure of the people. They're just good at making noise, right? But you know who they used to hate the most? Not the people that fight back, right? They used to hate passionately, and same with those ridiculous teachers who like to pretend they're on a power trip, right? They used to hate the smart alecks, right? The people who can reduce them to rubble through their sarcasm or their wit, right? Or just ask them relevant questions and they'll reveal their own stupidity in front of the people. And it's the same case here when it comes to the question of values and the questions of identity. There also exists from this, what it reveals, this whole discussion around hijab, is the contradiction, the inherent contradiction in Western values. And when I say Western, again, specifically secular values. That for how long were we told that Western societies are the beacon of tolerance, of diversity and acceptance, right? Seriously, who believes that now? Who believes that now? Who believes that now? They don't believe it themselves. And they expect Muslims to accept that? Right? The Western countries have moved, and particularly in Europe, from policies of multiculturalism, right, which is assimilation through a different word, right, it's what we call indirect assimilation, to policies of direct assimilation. And you hear the currents loud and clear. It's either do this or go home. And sure, the public opinion has to start somewhere, but if it continues as it does, then its inevitability, we all know where it's going to lie. And this, of course, again, underpins the identity crisis that exists in the West. But it's also a realization, and I'll say it again in case we missed it the first time, that non-Muslims have realized, and when I say non-Muslims, I thought I'll bring it up in a moment, but I'll say it now. If I make reference to kuffar or non-Muslims or whatever else, I don't mean Joe Blow, right? I don't mean whatever, the man from the streets. I mean, you know, the capitalist class, the politicians, think tanks, right? The movers and shakers in society, right? I'm talking about Joe Blow, your neighbours and whatnot. But they've realised the danger that exists when individual identities, right, morph into collective identities, because from that is derived the notion of collective mobilization, right? And that accurately, like very, very aptly describes the reality of the Muslims today. That we are a very nascent community, but one with enormous potential. And so the question is, how do we nip it in the bud before it becomes a real problem? Right? So we don't just ask for, you know, for a prayer place at Sydney Uni, right? We're going to ask for half the uni one day. We're going to ask for the, you know, one day to put the shahed there at the front or something, right? So it's described. But the point is, it starts somewhere, but it'll end up somewhere else. And after all of this, right, the main discussion should be, well, what do we do about it? Seriously, what message am I propagating? It's great to have this discussion, yeah, and to discuss it or to describe it in certain words. But in the end, it's one thing to look in the past and see what has happened. But you know, we need to look into the future, not as a series of inevitabilities of which we have no control, over which we have no control, but in fact, we need to ensure that we are participants in this debate, that we are, you know, makers of our own actions, so to speak. So we're not just subjects being described or, you know, policies being developed over. We are active participants in forming our own future. That's the first point. My second point is just to relax, in all honesty. Just to relax. If anyone feels that Muslims are under pressure, if the hijab has been attacked, if our aqidah has been under attack, if our prophet has been insulted, mate, seriously, just relax. Right? It's actually a strength for you. It is actually a source of strength, because they are attacking these core components of our identity because they're the ones that feel threatened, not us. Right? We are sure of who we are. We are confident in what we believe, and we believe very strongly in the superiority of our Islam. No Muslim would disagree with this. No Muslim would disagree with this. And I say that very, very strongly. We should understand, of course, that we should not be in a defensive position at all on any issue. Right? So someone says, oh, this, you know, hijab is so backward and oppresses the women. I say, look, stop right there, right? I ain't going to discuss hijab. I'm not going to discuss capital punishment in Islam. I'm not going to discuss cutting the hand of the thief. I'm not going to discuss stoning the adulterer. Right? I'm going to discuss what underpins that. I said, who are you to define for me what's good and bad? You say this is barbaric, but upon what basis? Who says that secular liberalism is the criteria by which we measure everything? Who says that Islam should be measured or held accountable on that basis? Who are you to impose your own values upon Islam, the divine Islam? Who are you to judge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That's the first response of a Muslim. So if they shut the hell up, in a nice way, right? Excuse the language, right? Sit down, right, and let me do the talking now. Right? You've had your turn, you spewed only rubbish, now let me do the talking. Right? Your values, your systems, and your history is what's corrupt. Right? Which is not fit for humanity, and which has sort of wrought destruction upon the whole of humanity. And you want me to accept that? You only have to look outside to see its consequences, yeah? You only have to look outside. How will their women behave? How will their men behave? What sort of life do they live? You walk around campus, mate, it's like ghosts on faces. They walk around like ghosts. They have no purpose, no sense of direction. They have no agenda. They come from certain families built on certain values, right? Broken families, broken societies. They, you know, glorify pornography and prostitution. They sexualize our children, and they say, you Muslims should be like us. Well, sorry. I don't want anything you have. I have my Islam. And I'm not here to beg for your acceptance. It's the other way. Who are you to question Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Who are you to challenge an example of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? Who are you? How dare you question the hijab? How dare you question corporate punishment in Islam? How dare you question any aspect of Islam? Who are you? Right? That's the first thing you do. They tone it down, right? But the idea is, you go on the offensive, right? You go on the defensive. You're not here to apologise for your Islam. You're not here to explain away the hijab. And oh, we all believe in freedom, and if I want to wear it, I don't want to wear it. Can't, you know what, right? Say it as it is. It is an obligation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and my liberation, right, comes from my submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is what gives me greatness in this life, and certainly in the next life, inshallah. Right? And you say, who are you? What do you have? Right? You choose your own words, but get the message across. Right? Realize, of course, the inherent hypocrisy, right, in the West in terms of its values and in terms of its policies. Right? Again, before we're told multiculturalism, well, we love everyone. Right? We love everyone. Right? We saw the reality of that. When it suits them, they love us. When it doesn't, they kick us where? Right? Any Muslim that says, oh, if we're going to defend our position, as for example, hijab, I'm saying, look, we should say, right, according to their own values, right, they believe in the freedom of the individual, right, and they're just depriving us of that freedom. So look, brothers and sisters, seriously, with all due respect, right, their values, when you say it's a man-made system, yeah, it means the man, human being, can put down the law and can change the law. Can define one value today, accept one value today and reject it tomorrow. You should not build your strategy on something that is changeable. Right? You should not rely upon the parameters set by the kuffar to argue your case. Stay strong. As a Muslim, it's an obligation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and nothing will get between me and my creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you have a problem with that, you deal with it, mate. You deal with it. Right? And Muslims, and you know from experience, right, if anyone's having trouble on campus or other universities, right, if we present ourselves as weak, right, compromising and apologetic, right, they'll take the Salah away from you tomorrow. Right? As they did at New South Wales Uni, as they tried at UWS in Parramatta, another in Penrith, right, you present yourselves as weaklings, they'll treat you as weaklings and they'll stomp all over you. Show them you're strong, you're firm, they'll have 1,000 questions to ask themselves before they try anything on the Muslims. Realise from this the sublimity of Islam. And I mean that genuinely. An extension of the first point, which is going on the offensive. Right? Understand that what we have in our possession is what the whole of humanity desperately needs. Desperately needs. And even some patients who don't want to swallow the medicine, you know what the good doctor always does. Because he's got the best interest of his patients at heart. We're not going to wait for anyone. Right? We have our divine message, our divine purpose, and our divine obligations. And we have a divine responsibility to export this to the rest of humanity. Starts right here in Sydney, right? On this campus. Starts right here and ends somewhere else. We should all understand that. So we should, in fact, rather than being apologetic and defensive for our Islam, it should be the opposite. We are so confident and so grateful for the fact that we are Muslims and we've been blessed with Islam. We want to share it with everyone. We want everyone to taste what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed us to taste. But there's another point which I suppose could be a basis for a future discussion. Just to realise that, you know, a lot of times when we have these sorts of discussions, it's always talked about in the context of us as individuals. What can I do as a Muslim? Which is obviously a very relevant question, a very important question, one that needs a very serious answer. But keep in mind that we're talking about non-state actors trying to challenge the authority of state actors. It's not just, you know, these ideas and these challenges presented to the Muslims and these attacks we feel upon our Islam, they're not pulled out of the vacuum, yeah? They're not pulled from God knows where. You live in a society built on a certain basis that holds certain values sacrosanct, and anything that seeks to challenge them, right, even if it's by virtue of its very existence, yeah, because none of us consciously do that and say, wake up today and I'm going to challenge Australia. No one says that, but it's by virtue of your Islam or what it represents. Exactly at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Quraysh knew from day one that what the Prophet ﷺ is preaching is going to threaten them and everything they represent. So the point is, realise that we are non-state actors trying to challenge the overwhelming power of state actors and, of course, the minions of the state and the media and whatnot. And that should push us to understand that the Muslims really are left wide open for these sorts of attacks. Specifically because we do not have an authority over us that will act on our behalf. Now that does nothing to say, or describes nothing in terms of what needs to be done right now. It just means that we have to carry the burden that would otherwise have been carried through a state. Right? Ideologies are not exported by individuals. They are not implemented by individuals, nor are they protected by individuals. They are implemented, exported and protected through institutional power. Right? Governments derive their legitimacy based on the ideology that exists in these lands. And so too in the Western world, and so too in the Islamic world. So realise that the challenges we are confronting, we are doing so as non-state actors, which infinitely increases the level of responsibility and the burden that goes with that. But the point being, right, and this is the good news, that even in the absence of state authority, of institutional power, of the enormous resources that can be devoted towards this effort, economically, politically, militarily, right, we are still doing a fantastic job. Right? A bloody fantastic job. Right? Never in the history of humanity, right, has a civilization been shaken through non-state actors. We are stateless, we are powerless, and yet by virtue of our Islam, right, we are challenging the whole of Western civilization. Whether you like it or not, you are part of that. Even if you don't believe you are, the kuffar understand you are. So none of us should expect, no one should go away with the view that we are just mere observers in this charade. No, we have to be participants. We have to take a clear stand and choose our sides, because it's been painted very clear for us. It has been painted very clear for us. What our sisters wear is symbolic of what Islam represents. Sure, it may start with the hijab because it's observable and it's symbolic, right? But the target is not the hijab. The target is everything that the hijab represents. That's why a discussion about hijab would be the same discussion about any other aspect of Islam, because it is merely symptomatic of the belief system that is inherent in every Muslim and that lies at the heart of Islam. This is my very, very short talk and a very short presentation on the issue of hijab and what underpins it, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan. I suppose in the time now, we'll leave the floor open for question and answers, inshallah. Everyone just get on with the job then. It's really as simple as that, I believe. Going once? Going twice? Always say first. I'm not sure how to understand this response. I'm really not sure. You know, the teacher's oldest fear. I think I've used that joke too many times. Like the kids got, they give a silent response to the teacher. It means one of two things, yeah. If they understood everything, or its opposite, they understood nothing. So I don't know which one it is. Tell me, even if it's for the purpose of self-assurance.
Probably the former. Probably the former.
Inshallah. Alright, we don't need to dwell on. If there's no questions or comments, inshallah, then we'll conclude today's proceedings. Jazakallah khairan for your attendance and for your attention. Inshallah, there's some benefit in this discussion, inshallah, to grow stronger from it. Jazakallah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.